Welcome to our elementary statistics tutorial on tables. In this module, you will learn the definition of one-way tables, the definition of two-way tables, and how to interpret data in one- and two-way tables. A one-way table is similar to a bar chart. It presents data from a single categorical variable in the form of frequencies. Recall that a categorical variable is a non-numerical variable that's described in words. The one-way table may present raw data, the number of each category in a population, or relative frequency, the proportion of each categorical variable in a population. That is, a raw data example would be the number of cats with the fur color brown, whereas the relative frequency would be the proportion of cats in the population with a fur color brown. Let's look at an example. We'll translate this bar chart to a one-way table. The bar chart shows the number of members of a population who selected each of pizza, hamburgers, and tacos as their favorite fast food. The first step in translating this bar chart to a table is to count the number of members of the population who selected each of the categorical variable values. 100 members of the population selected pizza as their favorite fast food, 75 selected hamburgers, and 125 selected tacos. Now sketch out our one-way table. In the first row, we list each of the possible categorical values for favorite food: pizza, burgers, and tacos. In the second line, we'll list the frequencies. We take these frequencies directly from the bar chart: 100 preferred pizza, 75 burgers, and 125 preferred tacos. We can also display this information in terms of relative frequencies. The relative frequency is just the proportion of the population who chose each variable, and it's calculated by dividing the frequency for a given variable value by the total number of members of the population. So, for example, the relative frequency of pizza is equal to 100 divided by the total number of members of the population, 300, or 33%. We can also make this calculation for burgers and tacos to find that 25% of the population prefers burgers and 42% of the population prefers tacos. So in this table, we can see in the first line the different categorical variable values. The second line, the frequencies in the population for each categorical variable. And in the third line, the relative frequencies or proportion of the population who prefer each value. Now let's consider two-way tables. Two-way tables display frequency or relative frequency data for two categorical variables. They're useful in finding information about relationships between variables. Consider the following table showing the relative frequency that individuals from two different age groups sampled identified various reading materials as their favorites. This table shows the overall relative frequency of each categorical variable pair. That is, if we want to know the proportion of Generation Xers who preferred newspapers, we look in the first row and the first column to find that 25% of the population is comprised of Generation Xers who prefer newspapers as their favorite reading material. Note that there are not equal numbers of categories in each categorical variable. For the categorical variable reading material, there are four possibilities: newspapers, books, magazines, and blogs. For the categorical variable age, there are two possibilities: Generation X, age 40 plus, or Generation Y, age less than 40. By summing up the values in the columns, we can determine the total proportion of the population of Generation Xers and Yers combined who prefer each reading material. So, the total proportion of the population that prefers newspapers is 35%. Books, 20%, magazines, 20%, and blogs, 25%. By summing the values in the rows, we can find out the total proportion of the population that's comprised of Generation X and Generation Y. This is particularly important for looking at relationships. We find that half of the population was taken from Generation X and half of the population was taken from Generation Y. Note that the sum of each of the totals is 1. This makes sense because there are only 4 reading material variables sampled, so the sum of the relative frequency for each of the reading materials should be 1. Similarly, only 2 generations were sampled, so the sum of the relative frequencies for the two generations should equal 100%. As mentioned before, this table shows the overall relative frequency of each categorical variable pair. It's interesting to compare each of the values to understand generational differences. For example, in Generation X, the older generation, 25% of the population prefers newspapers as their favorite reading material, whereas in Generation Y, only 10% prefer newspapers. In Generation X, books are much more preferable compared to Generation Y. Similarly, you can see that in Generation Y, blogs are much more preferable than to Generation X. 20% of Generation Yers prefer blogs as a reading material, but only 5% of Generation X prefer blogs. There are other ways to display categorical variable information in two-way tables. This table shows the relative frequency of the column variables with respect to each row variable. That is, the information shown shows only the proportion of Generation Xers or Yers who prefer each reading material. Thus, if you want to know what proportion of Generation Xers prefer newspapers, look in the Generation X